The one when we all met for the first time, I don't know if you remember it. It was in East Harlem.
It started with the news of her passing, the sudden ache that seemed to stir in an old part of a heart he thought had long made peace. Diane Keaton left the world at 79, and for Al Pacino, what followed was not just sorrow, but an admission steeped in decades of regret. He never framed it as a public confession of weakness, but in letting the words slip, he revealed a struggle that many suspected yet few acknowledged. The groaning weight of love lost, choices made, and the haunting question of what might have been. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. They had shared a time when their professional and personal lives overlapped in startling ways. Working together on the iconic film series, they embodied characters whose tensions mirrored their private entanglements, and over the years their relationship became quietly central to each of their stories. With Diane's passing, Pacino admitted the emotional toll he carried, the regret that even after decades felt raw, and the struggle to reconcile his life with a path he didn't walk. For Pacino, this admission marked a departure from his usual guardedness. He has always been fiercely protective of his vulnerabilities, choosing roles that reflected fortified characters, delivering lines with an almost impervious bravado. But in this moment, he allowed a crack to form in the facade. The admission was simple. Yes, I regret. Yes, I struggle. Yes, I felt the loss far more deeply than I ever admitted. That alone made it news, because it revealed that the seeming strength of his public persona did not signify freedom from pain. The nature of his struggle is multifaceted. On one hand, there is the regret of what he views as a failure of commitment, of having declined an ultimatum, or of having avoided the permanence she sought. On the other hand, there is the deep emotional dissonance of watching someone who once stood beside you depart, knowing you had been both present and absent. In the years that followed that relationship, Pacino built a life distinct from that chapter, but with Diane's death, the memories came flooding back, vivid and cutting. In his statement, he said the memories returned with a force that is both painful and moving. That phrase alone speaks volumes about a man who has long lived in the public eye but rarely let his public witness the interior tremors of his soul. The implications of this admission are rich. It suggests that as brilliant and as successful as Pacino has been, he too carries wounds. This humanizes him in a way that his larger-than-life screen image cannot. It invites reflection from those who see him simply as the toughened actor, the icon. It suggests that perhaps the greatest performances are not on screen but lived in retreat, where light meets shadow. For Pacino, acknowledging the struggle publicly legitimizes the idea that even those who appear unbreakable are vulnerable. The revelation shifts how we view both his past and his future. It asks us to reconsider that he might not have been the one always in control, always choosing his destiny, but rather someone who carried regrets as deeply as triumphs. His confession also underscores the weight of decisions undone. The relationship with Keaton was on and off, intense in its time, and imbued with the kind of Hollywood mythos that surrounds two major figures in film history. She once indicated she gave an ultimatum. He declined. He walked away rather than marry. She continued on a separate path. Over time, both had other relationships, other children, other roles. Yet for him, the unfinished nature of their chapter remained. His admission now brings closure not by rewriting the past, but by accepting its residue. It suggests that what he struggled with was less about her death per se, than about the fact that the door they shared once never closed, as he might have wanted. Now it is closing, in a way he cannot walk through. The struggle also touches on mortality and time. Pacino is 85. In the landscape of Hollywood longevity, he is one of the few living bridges to a certain golden era. Keaton's death reminds him that even icons are mortal. For someone who has spent much of his life embodying characters who defy death or resist it, this moment forces a reckoning with his own vulnerability. His regret is not simply for what he didn't do with her, but for the fact that time has moved on and taken her with it. He admitted that though the relationship ended more than 30 years ago, the memories remain vivid. He admitted that her passing triggered something inside him that he had perhaps long buried. That is a struggle with time, with loss, and with self. There is another facet to his admission: the struggle of identity outside the relationship. For many years, Pacino followed his own trajectory, challenging roles, a complicated personal life, multiple children, selective interviews. The relationship with Keaton was a significant chapter, but not the only one. By admitting the weight of not marrying her, he tacitly acknowledged that his choices were part of his identity. In doing so, He lets us see that every path chosen carries detours and what-ifs. He struggles with the sense that he perhaps prioritized his career, his freedom, or his fear of commitment over a different form of happiness. That recognition is painful because it forces a confrontation. What if I'd been different? What if I had chosen differently? The struggle then becomes internal, a man confronting his own life as a narrative of both achievement and regret. The effect of his admission resonates beyond his personal world. For fans, for students of cinema, for those who admire his craft, this moment reframes his legacy, adding depth, fragility, and honesty. It takes the mythic actor and maps a human experience of loss and longing. It invites those who have watched his work to consider not only the characters he played, but the man behind them, one who loves, who loses, who burdens himself with what might have been. That changes the conversation about success, about fame, about the sacrifices inherent in a life lived in limelight. His struggle becomes not a cautionary tale, but a mirror, one that shows the cost of choices and the ghosts we carry. Moreover, his admission has implications for how we understand relationships in Hollywood's spotlight. The narrative of Pacino and Keaton had long fascinated the public, two actors entwined in art and life, whose collaboration in one of cinema's greatest sagas gave rise to speculation, admiration, and ultimately heartbreak. By acknowledging his struggle, Pacino lifts the veil on the reality behind the glamour. The fact that even relationships formed in the bright glare of fame can harbor profound personal cost. It challenges the myth of celebrity relationships as immune to common regrets, forging a bridge between public showmanship and private sorrow. The implication is that fame does not insulate you from the grief of what you didn't do or what you left behind. The admission also shifts the dynamics of memory and legacy. Pacino recognized that her influence on his life extended beyond their relationship. He said she influenced the direction of his life. That recognition forces an internal reckoning. The choices he made were influenced by her, and yet he still holds regret for the decision not to formalize what they had. The struggle lies in reconciling influence with action, affection with decision, presence with departure. His admission states no illusions about turning back time. Rather, it is a confrontation with how the past shapes the present. The implication is that memory may be vivid, but it is imperfect and requires acknowledgement to heal. In many ways, the admission is an act of liberation. For Pacino to admit his regret and struggle is to release the silence that often accompanies such loss. It acknowledges that the old guard actor, long perceived as unflinchingly strong, has internal battlefields. It opens the possibility of compassion, not only from the public, but from himself. He is admitting that he was not perfect, that he failed in some way, and that failure remains a burden. In doing so, he makes space for a new narrative, one of acceptance, of fragility, of redemption and truth. The implication here is powerful, that the greatest courage sometimes lies not in action, but in acknowledgement. The timing of the admission is also telling. It arrives in a moment where both men and women of his generation are facing the reckoning of time, legacy, and mortality. With Diane gone, the chapter cannot be rewritten, only remembered differently. Pacino's struggle thus translates into a broader meditation on how we live after our most significant relationships end. It implicates everyone who has ever loved and lost, made choices and wonders what might have been. His admission becomes communal. The burden he carries is one millions carry. By bringing it into view, he normalizes it. Yet the struggle is not simply melancholic. Embedded in his admission is the faint light of understanding. He does not solely dwell in regret. He recognizes the gift she was, acknowledges her energy, and pays tribute to her enduring mark. In doing so, he merges sorrow with gratitude. That duality deepens the struggle. It is not only what he lost, but what he almost threw away and what remains despite it. The implication is that even in regret there can be honor, and even in loss there can be reverence. His admission reframes his journey not just as an actor in pursuit of roles, fame, and acclaim, but as a human being navigating relationships, time, and consequence. His struggle becomes a central part of his story, not an embarrassment to hide, but a wound to accept, and in doing so, he invites our humanity. His growth becomes not about the next performance, but about the living of a life that acknowledges its scars. Pacino's admission didn't just echo through the press, it rippled through the very atmosphere of Hollywood itself, where silence often masks truth and vulnerability is carefully managed like a fragile commodity. His words, bare and reflective, disrupted that norm. They peeled back the lacquered veneer of celebrity to reveal something achingly ordinary beneath: the human capacity for regret and the endless introspection that follows love's loss. For decades, he had been the emblem of masculine mystery and control, the artist who channeled rage, passion, and power into his performances, but guarded his private life like a sealed vault. Yet this confession broke that seal, and what emerged was not a scandal, not a confession of guilt or secret wrongdoing, but the simple, devastating acknowledgement of struggle. In doing so, Pacino unknowingly offered a masterclass in emotional honesty, not the kind spoken in interviews designed for publicity, but the kind that seeps out after years of holding it in. For an actor who had built an empire on restraint, on smoldering silences, calculated pauses, and the magnetism of words unsaid, his decision to articulate his pain carried a magnitude greater than most performances could. It wasn't the cinematic drama of Michael Corleone's fall or Serpico's defiance. It was something quieter, more tragic. This was Al Pacino, the man, not the myth, confronting the way a single person can inhabit one's heart for a lifetime, even when love has long ended. The psychological implications of that are profound. For Pacino, whose identity is intertwined with art, memory, and performance, Keaton's death forced an internal collapse of boundaries. The characters they once played had become part of their shared mythology. The Godfather trilogy immortalized their connection, freezing moments of intimacy and betrayal in celluloid amber. For the world, those scenes became part of film history. For Pacino, they became relics of a private truth, that every time he looked at those films, he was staring at a past self, at the reflection of a woman he once loved deeply. Keaton's death rendered those images sacred, not as art, but as personal archaeology, time capsules of a bond now unreachable. He admitted to the difficulty of revisiting those old roles, and one can understand why. Every frame now functions as both tribute and torment. It's not merely nostalgia, it's a confrontation. Watching her alive on screen is a visceral reminder that cinema grants immortality to those who have passed, but it also traps the living in the agony of perpetual remembrance. For Pacino, that must feel like both a gift and a curse. Forever able to see her smile, forever unable to reach beyond it. The emotional gravity of his confession lies in this paradox. To be an actor of his caliber is to live through imitation and yet to be haunted by truth. Pacino's struggle then is not only about love or death, it's about identity in the face of remembrance. When a performer's life and art are so closely fused, the loss of someone who shaped both becomes existential. It dismantles the division between creation and creator, between memory and imagination. Diane Keaton was not just a romantic partner or co-star, she was a mirror reflecting the best and worst parts of him. Losing her means losing that mirror and the version of himself it once revealed. There's also the deeper societal resonance of what his admission represents. In an industry that has long idolized emotional stoicism in men, Pacino's openness signals a quiet revolution. The old Hollywood archetype, men as unfeeling titans, women as muses, has been eroding for years, but rarely has one of its elder statesmen stripped himself so bare. By admitting to pain, he dismantled decades of masculine myth-making. His honesty stands as a refusal to conform to that outdated mold. It challenges the notion that aging icons must age into indifference. Instead, he shows that growth can mean turning inward, allowing vulnerability to become the measure of maturity. That vulnerability also speaks to the inevitable loneliness of a life lived in fame's shadow. Pacino, who never married and who has often spoken of solitude as both necessity and curse, now finds himself in a stage of life where the companions of his past are leaving one by one. Keaton's death was not just personal, it was emblematic of an era closing around him. The 70s generation of Hollywood, the rebels, the visionaries, the imperfect geniuses, are fading into history. Her passing reminds him of his own mortality, of the shrinking circle of those who knew him when he was not a legend but a young actor still figuring out the craft. That is a profound form of loss. The loss of witnesses to your becoming. Without them, one story begins to feel less anchored in shared memory and more like an echo fading into the distance. His admission thus becomes a conversation with time itself. Time, for Pacino, is no longer linear. It bends back on itself, folding memories of Keaton into his present grief. Each recollection becomes a living moment, each regret a chance to relive and reevaluate. In this way, his confession is not an endpoint but a process, a slow, deliberate reckoning with how life weaves love and art, failure and triumph, into something inseparable. He doesn't seek forgiveness or pity. What he seeks is truth. And that pursuit is perhaps what has always made his artistry transcendent. The gravity of his struggle deepens when viewed through the lens of legacy. For Pacino, legacy has never been about fame, it's about meaning. He has said in past interviews that acting was never simply a career but a calling, a compulsion to explore human truth. Now, in confronting the truth of his personal life, he mirrors that same intensity. This admission is not only about love lost, it's about confronting the question that shadows every artist near the end of their journey. What did it all mean? He has spent a lifetime portraying men who wrestle with conscience, desire, ambition, and loss. Now he himself embodies those struggles off-screen, stripped of scripts or second takes. In acknowledging his pain, he inadvertently redefines his artistry. The public sees his performances differently now, not as pure craft, but as expressions of lived emotion. His portrayal of longing in The Godfather Part 2 or despair in Scarface takes on new resonance, as if those roles were fragments of the man behind them. His confession reframes the narrative. The actor was not merely acting, he was excavating himself. There's also a spiritual dimension to his revelation. Pacino has often spoken of being drawn to characters who hover between redemption and damnation. In this moment, he seems to be experiencing his own version of purgatory, not as punishment but as purification. The struggle, he admits, is not destructive, it's cathartic. It suggests that after decades of embodying others, he is finally facing himself. And in that confrontation lies a kind of grace, the grace of understanding that even regret has purpose. It humanizes him not as an idol but as a pilgrim still seeking meaning at life's twilight. His relationship with Diane Keaton was, by all accounts, layered with contradictions: love and distance, passion and fear, devotion and deflection. Their dynamic, so famously mirrored in their on-screen chemistry, represented two artists who could not fully belong to one another because they belonged too much to their craft. That conflict between love and vocation is one that has haunted many great artists. For Pacino, the cost of choosing art over domestic stability was invisible for years. Now, with Keaton gone, the bill has come due. The struggle he speaks of is the payment for a lifetime of prioritizing creation over connection. Yet there's no bitterness in his tone, only a tender ache. That tenderness is what elevates his confession beyond self-pity. It reflects an evolution, from the fiery, uncompromising energy of his youth to the reflective humility of age. He does not condemn his younger self for being afraid of commitment. Instead, he recognizes that fear as part of his journey. The implication here is universal, that growth is not about erasing the past, but about making peace with its ghosts. Hollywood, for all its grandeur, is a lonely place for memory. Careers stretch long, friendships fade, and the pace of reinvention leaves little room for mourning. Pacino's honesty punctures that silence. It gives voice to the unspoken truth that even the greats feel forgotten sometimes. When he speaks of struggling after Keaton's death, he is not merely grieving her absence, he is mourning the loss of a witness to his humanity. She knew him before the myth solidified. She saw the man, not the monument. Losing her means, losing one of the last people who could look at him and say, "I remember who you were before all this." That realization is devastating, and it explains the depth of his struggle more than words ever could. What makes this revelation even more striking is its emotional restraint. Pacino does not weep publicly, nor does he dramatize his pain. His grief is measured, contemplative, like a man accustomed to analyzing emotion before expressing it. Yet that very restraint makes it more poignant. It is the stillness after the storm, the quiet acknowledgement that some sorrows cannot be performed. They can only be lived. That quietness, too, has implications for how we understand him. It suggests that for all his theatricality, he has always been guided by introspection. His confession, therefore, becomes not a spectacle but a meditation. The world of film has always blurred the lines between love and illusion, but Pacino's words remind us that even illusions leave emotional residue. The characters he and Keaton created together continue to live on screens, watched by new generations. In that sense, their story never truly ended. It keeps replaying in darkened theaters and streaming screens across the globe. But for Pacino, Those images now exist in a different register. What audiences experience as art, he experiences as memory. What we see as fiction, he feels as biography. This dual existence is perhaps his deepest struggle, to carry a love that belongs simultaneously to history, to cinema, and to himself. There's a certain poetry in the timing of this revelation coming late in his life. Pacino has reached an age where reflection becomes not optional but inevitable. Every loss magnifies the contours of mortality. Keaton's death was not just another farewell, it was a reminder that the clock cannot be rewound. And yet, in confronting that truth publicly, he transforms sorrow into wisdom. The pain becomes an offering, a final lesson from an artist who has spent a lifetime studying the human soul. His honesty gives permission for others, especially men of his generation, to admit their own wounds. This admission also reframes his relationship with the audience. For decades, people have projected strength, dominance, and invincibility onto him. Now, he invites them into the quiet spaces of weakness, uncertainty, and yearning. It's a gift in a way, a chance to meet the real man beneath the myth. Fans who grew up idolizing his characters now see that their hero bleeds like anyone else. The connection becomes more intimate, more sacred. Through his vulnerability, he restores authenticity to fame itself, reminding us that the best performances are not those that hide pain, but those that emerge from it. In artistic terms, his struggle also brings a new layer of interpretation to his future work. If he continues to act, every line, every gesture, every silence will now carry the invisible weight of this truth. He has reached a point in his career where his art and life are indistinguishable. That convergence, painful as it may be, can yield extraordinary depth. The artist becomes the art, and grief becomes the medium. Even if he never addresses Keaton directly again, every role from here on will bear her shadow, a subtle echo of love, loss, and understanding. Beyond the personal and artistic implications, Pacino's revelation speaks to a larger cultural moment. We live in an era obsessed with image and immediacy, where emotions are often curated for public consumption. In contrast, his admission feels raw, unfiltered, and profoundly human. It reminds us that authenticity still matters, that truth, even when uncomfortable, is the most enduring form of art. By sharing his private battle, Pacino defies the performative tendencies of celebrity culture. He doesn't use his confession to generate sympathy or spectacle. Instead, he uses it to communicate the simple fact that grief is not a scandal but a condition of being alive. There's an elegance to how he carries this truth. He neither apologizes for his past nor romanticizes it. He simply acknowledges it as part of his life's architecture. That balance between regret and acceptance reflects a rare wisdom. It shows that maturity isn't the absence of pain, but the ability to coexist with it. For Pacino, the struggle becomes less about overcoming and more about integrating, folding grief into gratitude, loneliness into reflection, loss into legacy. His words also cast a new light on Diane Keaton herself, not as a muse or memory, but as a force whose impact endures even in absence. She was an artist of equal stature, an actress of wit and eccentric grace. Their connection was one of equals, and his admission honors that equality. By speaking of her influence, he acknowledges not just her presence in his past, but her continued place in his consciousness. It's a rare act of homage, one that transcends romance and enters the realm of reverence. What Pacino revealed beneath the quiet tone of his admission was not simply grief for a lost love, but the raw truth of a man whose identity had been built upon intensity. For years, his life and art had been indistinguishable, each feeding the other in a cycle of creation and collapse. But in the face of Diane Keaton's death, that balance shattered. What was left was the unvarnished man, stripped of performance, forced to face what no audience could help him navigate, the reckoning of memory. It is one thing to mourn someone you loved, it is another to confront how deeply that person defined you. Pacino's acknowledgement made clear that Keaton was not just part of his past. She was a fixed star in his internal universe. Every artistic choice, every role that flirted with loneliness or obsession, carried a whisper of her. It was as if, in losing her, he lost a fragment of his own compass. For decades, his characters had been marked by a peculiar ache, the haunted eyes of men caught between love and power, truth and illusion. Now that ache has a name. His struggle after her death completes a circle long drawn in silence. the artist who spent his life portraying human contradiction finally confronting his own. This new openness also represents a subtle act of rebellion against the machinery of Hollywood myth. Pacino has always resisted the industry's polished narratives. He chose not to marry, not to conform, not to tame his creative restlessness for the comfort of image. And now, in his later years, he defies another unwritten rule, the one that says great men must die stoic and invulnerable. Instead, he opens himself to pain. In doing so, he dismantles the illusion that emotional transparency belongs only to youth. His confession reclaims vulnerability as a sign not of weakness, but of wisdom, a hard-earned honesty that only age and loss can grant. It is also a reflection on how art binds people beyond time. Pacino and Keaton will forever be joined in the cultural memory of The Godfather. Their characters, Michael and Kay, embodied the eternal dance of love and estrangement. She was the light he could never hold, the moral conscience he tried to silence, the tenderness that stood in stark contrast to his descent into darkness. Audiences watched their cinematic relationship fracture, unaware that off-screen, something similar was unfolding. Now, with Keaton gone, that art feels almost prophetic. It foretold the emotional distance he would later lament. Every line between them, every look exchanged in those films seems to carry an unspoken weight, evidence of a truth that neither could fully articulate then, but he now can barely bear to face. The emotional significance of that realization cannot be overstated. To watch oneself in youth is to confront what can never return. For Pacino, those films are not just art, they are home movies of a vanished life. They remind him of a time when possibility still existed, when love was alive, and when regret had not yet hardened into permanence. Now, each rewatch is an act of mourning. He sees her laughing in a way she will never again, sees himself in the bloom of vitality, and knows that no future scene can be written to change that ending. His struggle is the struggle of an artist condemned to remember too vividly. At a deeper level, Pacino's admission carries philosophical implications about the nature of success and fulfillment. For much of his life, he was the embodiment of artistic ambition realized. Yet what he reveals now is that triumph without emotional resolution carries its own emptiness. The applause fades, the awards tarnish, but the quiet ache of unspoken love endures. In recognizing that, Pacino speaks to an essential human truth, that no amount of achievement can compensate for the absence of emotional peace. His struggle after Keaton's passing is thus not just the sorrow of an individual, but a reflection of a universal dilemma, the tension between purpose and intimacy, between doing and being. In many ways, this moment redefines the meaning of legacy for him. He has already secured his place among the legends of film, yet his latest words will linger as powerfully as any monologue he has delivered. They reveal a man unafraid of being seen as fragile. That is a radical act for someone whose entire persona was built on mystery and intensity. By sharing his emotional struggle, Pacino transforms legacy into something more than memory. It becomes communion. He doesn't merely want to be remembered as a great actor, he wants to be understood as a man who lived, erred, and felt deeply. There is also something profoundly poetic in how his revelation invites empathy rather than pity. He doesn't seek consolation. Instead, he offers reflection. His tone is not desperate but contemplative, a man turning the pages of his own story and pausing at the chapters he once skimmed over too quickly. That stillness speaks louder than any lament could. It suggests that he has finally reached the stage of life where truth matters more than protection, where connection outweighs control. For those who admired him, this new honesty recontextualizes decades of distance. Pacino has long been regarded as enigmatic, even aloof, yet his openness shows that reticence often hides not arrogance but fear. The fear of exposing too much, of being consumed by one's own intensity. In finally articulating his pain, he relinquishes that fear. He chooses vulnerability over mystique, memory over myth. That choice reshapes how we perceive him, not as an untouchable icon, but as a man learning at last to live with his own humanity. His admission also sparks a broader conversation about how we process loss in an age obsessed with reinvention. Pacino's grief is not tidy, not the kind that fades gracefully into acceptance. It lingers, raw and unresolved. That honesty stands in defiance of a culture that demands recovery on schedule. By allowing himself to struggle publicly, he validates the fact that grief doesn't end, it evolves. Love doesn't vanish, it transforms into presence within absence. His struggle becomes an argument for depth in a world that fears it. There's a visual poetry to imagining Pacino in solitude now, sitting in the dim light of memory, surrounded by relics of his craft. Old scripts, photographs, mementos from films where he and Keaton's paths crossed. Each artifact carries the echo of her laughter, the trace of her influence. The silence between them, once bridged by conversation and collaboration, is now filled with ghosts of dialogue. Yet in that silence, there is also peace. His struggle, painful as it is, allows him to inhabit those memories fully, to honor what was rather than evade it. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on Al Pacino's emotional confession after Diane Keaton's death? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.